How rough will the financial waters be for Canada as we head into winter in the second wave of the pandemic? The federal government outlined its economic priorities in the fall economic update, and for those who get seasick from waves of red ink, the numbers could be nauseous. On the other side of the coin, we and the rest of the world are in uncharted territory when it comes to navigating an economy in a pandemic. Now, we asked you on our Unpublished.vote question of the announcements in the fall economic update, which do you feel will help Canadians the most? A tax on digital services, national childcare program, overhaul the tax system, $1 billion for long-term care, other, none of the above, and undecided. I found surprisingly none of the above was at 2/3. Now, however you're watching and listening to our show, whether through our social media channels on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, or our podcast channels, iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and more, I'd like to remind you, you can still cast your vote on this topic at unpublished.vote and then email your MP to tell them why. Now, joining us this evening to discuss this issue is Ian Lee, professor with the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. Jim Stanford is an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. Brenda Slater's with the Association of Canadian Independent Travel Advisors, and Aaron Woodrick is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. And I thank you all for joining us. And we'll start off with you, Ian. We talked on the podcast, $400 billion and as a deficit. It didn't worry you, but it's the addition to the debt that could bring reaction to the markets, right?
That's my view. I'm not suggesting Canada's on the edge of insolvency. Of course not. We do have a printing press called the Bank of Canada, but I'm also not of that school that says you can just add on gargantuan amounts indefinitely into the future. Mm-hmm. I'm very much in the David Dodge school that says, short run, we can afford it, but we've got to bring it back very, very quickly. And I know we've talked about, and other people have talked about various tax measures. The ghost in the room that no one's talking about is I think we're going to be looking at very serious austerity, very similar to 1995, because there aren't enough taxes that can be passed to pull back that enormous amount of money to bring it into sustainable territory.
Jim, how concerned are you that interest rates could rise and throw the federal plan right out of whack?
Well, Ed, the higher interest rates would make a terrible difference to it, no doubt about it. In fact, the great irony is the government's actually saving this money on interest payments this year. About $4 billion is what interest costs are going down, even though the amount of debt is going up by that large deficit. And that is because interest rates have fallen so close to zero. Now, everybody says, what happens if they go back up? Well, interest rates are not something that's set on Mars. Interest rates are determined by our Bank of Canada on the basis of economic conditions, including how different borrowers would be able to react to higher interest rates. That includes the government, obviously, but it more importantly includes Canadian households who have huge debts of their own. Canadian household debt is much, much bigger than government debt. So those factors, the reality that so much of the economy couldn't handle very high interest rates, is going to restrain any effort by the Bank of Canada or even by financial markets to drive interest rates up. So I'm confident that interest rates are going to be very low for some years to come.
Now, Brenda, the tourism industry was hit very hard, and you're with the Association of Canadian Independent Travel Advisors. Was there anything in this update for your industry and members?
Well, I have two answers. The short answer is for independent advisors, no, nothing. Mm-hmm. For if you owned a brick and mortar travel agency, there were some additions in there for wage subsidy and rent subsidy and the change of the rent subsidy program. But other than that, unfortunately, no.
And, you're part of the airline industry. Obviously, you're off independent to the side. The airline industry didn't really get a lot of play in the economic update. Are you expecting perhaps you could be included in something a little later when that sort of become clear to the federal government?
Well, the hope is that with any airline bailouts that they will protect commissions for travel advisors and travel agencies. But right now, if the bailout goes through as planned, we are looking at having to repay, I think the number Actis tells us is $200 million in commissions that have to go back to the airline in order to have passengers refunded, which is massive when we don't have any revenue. So
and you're an independent business as well. Exactly. I'm glad we were able to get that point out. Now, Aaron, $100 billion in stimulus over 3 years. You've called for a tax cut stimulus to put more money in people's pockets. How is that approach better than spending?
Well, I would say from the fiscal update, it was eyebrow raising to see a pledge of stimulus without even specifying what it was going to be on. It's one thing to say, the government wants to achieve X and spend on this program, that program, but to throw a number out there and say, we've decided how much we want to spend and we'll figure out something to spend it on later. I thought that was a little bit odd. In terms of the tax cut proposal, I made that proposal early on in the summer. I would walk some of that back now because a lot of the money that has gone out the door has actually been accumulating in the bank accounts of Canadians. We've seen a lot of the statistics that show household savings are up. And you've even heard the finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, talk about how that could become a stimulus if that money is unlocked. And I'm very interested to see how the government will act moving forward, knowing that money is sitting in people's bank accounts. Is that going to have an impact on their argument that the government itself needs to borrow more to spend rather than trying to get those people to spend what they're sitting on?
Ian, revenue is the other side of the equation, and one angle that isn't being discussed that we did point out in the podcast was societal aging. What challenge is that presenting for Canada today?
I've been probably by myself on this issue during the COVID crisis because people are saying, the world's come to an end almost. We've gone over the cliff. I think this is a temporary crisis. COVID's going to go away. It's the moment we roll out that vaccine, and I'm not going to get into a debate when, whether it's 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, COVID's going to come to an end relatively quickly. But the way I like to put it is not one of us have stopped aging. Society is continuing to age. COVID, no COVID. COVID disappears. We are going to continue to age very rapidly. The dependency ratio is crashing down from 7 or 8 in the late 60s down to 2.5 people for every retiree. We know older people, the Chi-High data is crystal clear that older people like me above 65 consume a lot more healthcare. And when you get into your 70s and 80s, it's just gargantuan. And so these problems, and of course, the economy is slowing down. All of the studies from including finance show that as we age, the GDP is going to slow down. And that means in plain English, that revenues flowing into the federal and provincial and municipal governments are going to slow down because they're so sensitive to GDP growth. And so we're looking at expenses going through the roof while revenues are going to be going down. At the same time, we've rolled up this enormous indebtedness, and we're not going to get the growth that we saw in the late 90s that we used to deal with the downsizing at that time. That's not going to happen this time around. So we're going to get pincers on both sides on this, and it's going to create enormous problems going forward.
Now, Jim, a national child care program, you feel it would create 300,000 jobs and between $19 to $27 billion annually. And I guess the first thing I'd want to know is how would you get to that point?
Well, our research on that subject, Ed, looked at 3 different categories of benefits that are created by a rollout of a national childcare program, and it wouldn't happen overnight. It would probably take 10 years to get fully rolled out. The first is the jobs and work associated with actually running those childcare centers and delivering those services. So that would generate, we estimated, around 200,000 direct jobs in the centers, and then probably another 80,000 or so in all of the different industries that depend on the childcare centers for their own business, everything from construction to business services to consumer services. The second category, and in a way the most important, is what a childcare program means for female labor force participation. Right now, in the prime parenting age groups, women's labor force participation is about 8 percentage points lower than it is for men. And childcare is a huge part of that. We've seen from the experience in Quebec, when they rolled out their program, women's labor force participation and women's employment, and then incomes and tax revenues all grew dramatically. So if you did that across the country, you'd get several 100,000 additional workers in the labor force and generating income and paying taxes. Then the third category of benefits is, in a way, the most sort of long run and hard to quantify, but I still think they're important. The scientific evidence suggests that there's important cognitive improvements that kids get by getting that high quality early education while they're in their early years, while their synapses basically are still developing. So put all those together and you're looking at it generating a boost to GDP and a boost to government revenue that's larger than what it actually costs to provide the service. And other studies have confirmed that they think the benefits, including fiscal benefits from childcare, exceed the cost. So at this moment, when we need, every economic boost we can get, I think this is a good one.
But if it's such a revenue, a job creator, why hasn't it been done before? Like I think back to 2004 when Paul Martin was talking about it, but that was, that we've always heard about this childcare program, and then just if it's going to provide the revenue, if it's going to provide the jobs, I don't care if you're a conservative, you'd be all over something like that, you would think, right?
No, I think, and there have been changing attitudes. First of all, most countries have done it. So why haven't they done it? Well, most countries have done it. And in Canada, we're a bit of a laggard. Quebec has done it. There are changing attitudes in the business community. For example, you've seen the Canada Business Council, the major banks, other business leaders come out and say this is something that would boost Canada's economy. Even here in BC, where I live, the major Conservative Party, which is called the Liberal Party out here, they ran in this election that just happened with a very ambitious childcare program. So I do think it's becoming less of a partisan issue, and there's more buy-in from across the spectrum as to these economic benefits.
Now, Brenda, we talked about your organization, of course, independent and small businesses dealing with the fall financial update. I'm wondering, because your group is fairly new and diverse, what kind of response are you getting from political leaders to your plight?
It's quite interesting. The PCs are very interested and very engaged in meetings with us. We actually have one meeting tomorrow with 5 MPs all at the same time. But we have a total, I think, of 9 MP meetings tomorrow. I would say the large majority of them are PCs. The Liberals are a little bit harder to get on the phone to commit to a 30-minute Zoom meeting. But the ones that we have met with have been extremely effective and very helpful. And we are very grateful for the help that we've had to get the word on the street of what we're going through and how much we're falling through the cracks.
Now, Aaron, we talked about the $100 billion over 3 years, but you're concerned that the government has no clue what to spend on. If you put it off to the side saying you've got it there, maybe you don't have to spend it. Is that decent bookkeeping or no?
Well, look, they don't have it. They're talking about borrowing. And I think governments run into trouble when they decide how much they want to spend before they decide what they want to spend it on. I think we can have a debate if you say, here's our priority X, we're going to spend X dollars on it. I think that's fair game. And some people are going to like it and some aren't. But if you're just committing to a number for its own sake, I think a lot of people start to say, well, shouldn't you really be focusing on delivering certain things and doing it obviously without wasting any money, rather than saying we're going to spend this much money and we'll come up with something to spend the money on.
Ian, Canadians have accumulated, and we talked about this earlier, more savings during the pandemic. Some estimates put it at $150 billion, but our debt to income ratio is about $1 to $1.71. Is this where Canadians should be using that extra to pay down their debt because you don't know what's coming?
I'm not so sure. Years ago, I was a mortgage manager before I became a professor. I've studied these numbers very intently. Every journalist that talks about this alleged indebtedness crisis of Canadians talks about the $2 trillion that we owe, and I'm talking individual debt, not corporate or government debt that Jim was referring to a moment ago. Every journalist refuses to talk about the asset side of the balance sheet, and StatsCan publishes it every 3 months, the household balance sheet. We have assets, we own assets of over 13 trillion. You subtract the 2 trillion debt, we have net worth of over 11 trillion, which per Stats Canada, not my numbers, is over $300,000 per person. Now, I tell this to my students and they say, wait a minute, I'm not worth 300,000. My answer is, of course you're not, because us older people are worth a lot more than 300,000. But my point being that this idea that we're all going over the cliff into bankruptcy is just not supported empirically. And yes, I know some people don't own their house, but 70% of Canadians do. It's one of the highest rates of home ownership in the world. And this idea that we're all, in desperate financial shape is not true. Even in the COVID crisis, most of us did not lose our job. The economist calls it the 90-10 economy. 90% of us are doing okay. 10% of us, of course, are absolutely devastated and destroyed in accommodation, tourism, airlines. But that doesn't mean all of us lost our job. In fact, no one in the public sector, or almost no one in the public sector, lost their job. Professors weren't sent home and cut off and laid off. Neither were school teachers. Neither were federal public servants. Neither were large corporations. So, in other words, we could be targeting the 10% rather than using this as an approach to go after and try and provide extended benefits to a larger number of people that don't need the support.
No, so like when you talk about targeting, that would that be sort of like the national child care program? Some folks do not need that support as opposed to others who obviously desperately do.
Well, I've testified several times in the last 2, 3, 4 years before House of Commons Finance Committee, and I have argued, and I've upset some people, but I've argued that universal pharmacare, universal daycare is morally irresponsible. Giving free daycare to Ian Lee or a professor or free drugs is just, who doesn't need it and doesn't deserve it. Giving free drugs and free daycare to high income people in the top 2 quintiles, I think is morally irresponsible. We should be targeting people who really do need help in our society at the bottom and not give it to people at the top or in the top 2 quintiles.
Jim, how would that work with your national child care program? Would it be more targeted?
Oh no, the whole idea of it is to make it universal. And this is again where Ian and I are old friends, but on this one we'll part ways. We don't run our healthcare system like Ian just suggested. We don't run our schools like Ian just suggested. We've recognized that there's benefits to having essential public services delivered to everyone, regardless of their income. And if you're concerned about fairness and making sure that people pay their fair share towards it, then you do that through the tax system, through a progressive tax system. Then those well-income people who also benefit from free healthcare, and in this case, free pharmacare and free childcare, will pay for it through their taxes. And the international experience shows that leads to a much more inclusive and healthy functioning society than one in which those costs of sort of targeted programs, by and large, end up deteriorating in quality and end up being a barrier to full equality. So I would like to see the child care program and the pharmacare program be on the same principles as our schools and our healthcare system today.
Now, Brenda, when we look at your organization and obviously independent people, small business people, what do you need now from the federal government?
That's a really good question. I would say the biggest thing that we need from the Liberal government is communication.
In what sense?
We need them to tell us what their plan is to restart the tourism economy, and that's both inbound and outbound. We need them to be doing more rapid testing in more centers, using more different varieties of rapid tests. There are many out there, so that when the time comes for the borders to open, that they will have the required amount of data. But most importantly, we need some kind of protection for independent advisors who are going to be facing a great deal of money in recall commissions. That we're all for refunding our passengers. We believe they should get their money back, but we don't believe that it should be at our expense. We provided services almost over a year ago and have filed our taxes and paid our taxes on those services, and now they're asking for that money to be returned to them. It's that's the most important thing in front of us right now.
All right. Now, Aaron, we've got a question coming in from Facebook Live. How quickly do you think Canada's economy can recover from COVID if, as Ian says, it will come to a swift end this year?
Yeah, that's the $1 trillion question, right? And we're all hoping for what everyone talks about is a V-shaped recovery. I think that would be the best case scenario. But that's, again, coming back to the government's fiscal update. My concern is that the government is going to attempt to stimulate by spending a lot of money that they don't have. Historically, they have not had good outcomes as a result of that. We had very slow growth. We had a very stagnant economy ever since the Great Recession, and even going back a little bit further than that. The challenge has always been getting strong growth. And the government has tried a lot of different tricks and they have not really succeeded. And my fear is they're just going to double down on the same strategy. So I'd love to give a firm answer. I wish I knew. I'd bet money on the market on it, but As much as we hope, I still think we're probably, half a year to a year away from knowing, how quickly things can reopen. Because of course, Ian's point about the vaccines, they're coming. But as we've heard, just because everyone's vaccinated doesn't mean you can reopen everything, doesn't mean every country is going to reopen, and industries like travel will be back to 100%. So I still think we're way off from back to 100%. But certainly with the vaccines, that date is probably a lot closer than it would have otherwise been.
Ian, I'm looking at the situation here. What do you think about this question? How quick do you think
I
the
don't
economy
want to
can
leave
recover?
the idea that I think it's going to turn around in 3 months, but I have looked at all the major forecasts by the banks, by David Dodge's forecast, the Parliamentary Budget Office, and nobody's suggesting it that I know of this. It's going to go up to 2030. And in fact, look at Finance Canada in the economic update. They're projecting a full recovery within roughly 2 years. 2023, some are suggesting 2024. The point is it's going to come fairly quickly. We don't yet know how quickly the vaccine is going to be rolled out to everybody. I suspect that once they get it out there, the drug companies, it's in their self-interest to ramp up production a lot more quickly than we think. And people are going to be jumping up and down, and I'm going to be one of them, to get that vaccine. And I think once we do vaccinate most of the people in the country, we're going to see the resilience of the private sector return. And I think the economy will return very quickly. And I don't accept the argument that we need stimulus for the entire economy. If 90% of us are doing okay, which we are, or we've only lost, and I say only, about 1 million people pre-COVID. Compared to pre-COVID, there's 1 million more to work. Yes, we have to focus on those 1 million people. Yes, we've got to help them. We've got to help the travel agents, as we just heard from Brenda. But the idea that we should be throwing money at the other 90%, people in the public sector like me, we don't need help. We're doing okay. Let's target those who need help.
All right. Now, Jim, just going by Ian's idea, and on this question, say 2 years, the economy is back. What do you think the economy would look like in 2 years in Canada?
Well, I think it's going to be a bit of a longer, harder road than has been suggested so far. To some extent, we've seen a stronger recovery so far than I would have expected. We've regained about 80% of the jobs that were lost in the first months of the pandemic, just with the partial reopening that we've experienced. And that's more than I would have guessed. But I do think that we've had the low-hanging fruit in a way. And some of the difficulties, some of the challenges that we're going to face are now not related to health restrictions on workplaces or businesses. It's going to be more of the kind of economic damage that was done to consumer confidence, to business confidence and expectations. And I think that's where there will be I think it will take at least 2 or 3 years to try to get back to what our potential output would have been. And I think Ian is right in the sense that the sort of dramatic moment in the early pandemic of just providing as much purchasing power and income support as possible, which government did, I think that moment has passed, and we do need to be thinking, first of all, on the income supports of targeting it more carefully. And we've already seen that. The former CERB has been phased out, and we've now got an improved employment insurance system to try and target those benefits. And then I do think that it is going to have to come from the kind of macroeconomic stimulus end of it, things like infrastructure investment and other programs that will generate more work coming from the public sector as a way of supporting that longer run recovery back to our full potential.
And Brenda, I'm guessing that your folks, the people, the 1,200 members of your organization, can't wait that long, 2 years for the economy to come back, because one industry is looking for you to pay back money from this year.
Yeah, we're told the number of brick and mortars that will survive through the spring is about 30%. So for independent advisors like myself, because I work from home, I don't have the huge overhead, but I also don't qualify for CBUS. So we're going to lose a lot of people. We're going to lose a lot of very experienced people who can make this industry run. A lot of them are retiring. Some of them are just walking away. But probably right now I'm booking into 2022, and people are crossing their fingers that the cruises and the river cruises will be going then, because as the further we get into this, the further the dates are that they're canceling product. So generating revenue is going to be a while.
All right. Okay. Now, Aaron, in this economic update, obviously Canadians have been shopping online, virtual businesses, e-commerce, all popping up. Was there anything in this update that would see this sort of spurred on?
Sorry, the shopping online?
E-commerce, virtual businesses, that kind of creation.
Well, I think that may be a question of consumer habits changing. And that's actually an interesting question that we're all going to have to grapple with, is even after the crisis is over, the world will have changed in certain ways. Things like increased telecommuting, commuting patterns. What are the impacts for that on, for example, businesses that rely on a certain amount of foot traffic in downtown cores? I mean, this is all something that we're going to have to strike a balance between. You don't want to just throw people under the bus. I mean, for some people, it was just dumb luck, the line of work you were in. And I think a lot of people could say it's not fair to just say, too bad for you. But on the other hand, just trying to put everybody back in exactly the spot they were before and assuming that, those patterns are going to come back, I think is also not realistic. So we're going to have to, it's still a little too early to say what some of those patterns will be. But, one thing I look at from my standpoint in Ottawa is the federal government owns a lot of buildings. We need those buildings because they house government employees. If a lot of those employees are going to work from home, is that the sort of thing that the federal government needs to hold on to as an asset?
Yeah, and the other thing too is they wouldn't be paying taxes on those buildings as well. Ian, now you started this little round table here. What do you think the Canadian economy is going to look like in 2 years?
Well, again, I'm going to be a minoritarian. I think that the shortages that have been looming pre-COVID because of the aging and actually are continuing as we speak. I know people in contracting. My own brother is a contractor in Thunder Bay. His biggest problem is not taxes. It's not customers. He can't get people to work for him. And I've talked to many different contractors with this problem. It's only going to become more acute. 2 years from now, we will not be talking about unemployment. We'll be talking about the continuing looming job shortages because more and more boomers are going into retirement. In another 5 or 7 years, all the boomers will be retired. And so we are going to be facing serious shortages in the next 2, 3, 4 years. And that's what I'm worried about. We're so focused on COVID, understandably, because it's a terrible, terrible disease or virus. But we're not looking further out, medium term and longer term, saying we're going to have serious labor shortages in this country. And we've got to be focusing on that.
Now, Jim, I read your piece today. You feel the public sector has a role to play here.
I do, for the reasons I was hinting earlier, Ed. I think the full rebound in consumer confidence and business investment is going to take some time. So kind of like in the period after World War II is a historical analogy that I've looked at. We have been fighting a war against disease this time. And in the rebuilding, I think we're going to need public sector investment in physical infrastructure. Building roads and bridges is always helpful at a time like this, but also social infrastructure. And that's where I like this child care plan.
I understand that, but it only seems to employ a certain number of people, or just as obviously trades in terms of childcare. But there's a lot of other people who won't be able to benefit from that.
Well, as a way of initiating investment and production, the public sector can actually play a leading role as a growth industry. We often hear it described only as a cost or as something that is a drain. But in fact, when you look at jobs in healthcare and education and other public services, they've been a great boon to the economy. So in the years until the private sector gets back fully on its feet, expanding those jobs, I think, will be beneficial.
Well, we are out of time once again, folks. I want to thank you for joining us. Our guest on Unpublished TV, Ian Lee, professor at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University. Jim Stanford is an economist and the director of the Center for Future Work. Brenda Slater is with the Association of Canadian Independent Travel Advisors, and thanks for sharing your story. And Aaron Woodrick is the federal director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Now, this is our last show for 2020, but we will return with a brand new podcast in early January, followed by our next Unpublished TV. On behalf of the team here at Pop-Up Podcasting, JP, Will, and Lisa, and Unpublished Media, James O'Grady, Pat Friel, and myself, have yourself a wonderful holiday despite the challenges. Stay safe I'm Ed Hand.